He didn't flinch when I said it. That's what I remember most. Not the silence at the table, not the way my father-in-law's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, not even the way my husband looked at the floor like he'd suddenly found the grain of the wood fascinating. I remember that my father-in-law didn't flinch, just smiled, like I'd said something amusing, like I was a child who'd stumbled into a room full of adults and said something precocious. That smile is what changed everything. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old. I'm a senior financial analyst at a logistics firm, and I have been, for the past 4 years, the primary income earner in my marriage. I say that not to brag. I say it because it's the fact that everyone in my husband's family knew, referenced constantly, and treated as though it entitled them to something. My salary was discussed at their dinner tables the way people discuss the weather as a given, a backdrop, a resource that simply existed and could be drawn from without anyone needing to ask. My husband and I met in graduate school. He was finishing an MBA. I was doing my master's in finance. He was funny and warm and confident in a way that felt earned rather than performed. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony, nothing extravagant, and moved into an apartment I found and partially furnished before he'd even looked at the lease. I told myself that was just how it started. Someone has to take initiative. Someone has to move the pieces. His father, I'll call him Richard, because that's his name, and he's earned the directness, was a man who had spent 30 years building a mid-sized construction business in the Midwest. He was proud of it. He talked about it the way some men talk about their military service, with a kind of reverence that didn't leave room for questions. He'd also, by the time I entered the family, been quietly running that business into the ground for about 5 of those years. I didn't know that at first. Nobody told me. I pieced it together the way you piece together most things about families you marry into, slowly, through gaps in conversation, through numbers that don't add up, through the particular way certain topics make certain people go very still. My husband worked at his father's company. Not in a significant role, not at first, but Richard kept pulling him in deeper. Assistant operations manager, then operations manager, then a title that sounded impressive but seemed to require very little of my husband's actual time. He worked some days. He was home others. He talked about the business the way his father did, with pride, with ownership, with the assumption that I understood this was his legacy and therefore something that touched both of us. I asked questions early in our marriage. Healthy questions, I thought. How's the company doing? Is cash flow stable? Are there plans for growth? My husband would answer in ways that were technically responses, but contained very little information. Fine. Yeah, it's been a tough quarter, but they're working on it. Dad has a plan. I learned to stop asking because the answers were never answers. They were reassurances wrapped in vagueness, and at the time, I accepted them because I was tired after long days, and because I trusted him, and because marriage requires a degree of faith that sometimes looks, in retrospect, like deliberate blindness. The first sign I should have caught came about 18 months into our marriage. My husband mentioned casually, and he had a gift for casualness, for dropping things into conversation like they weighed nothing, that his father might need some help covering payroll one week. A short-term thing. A cash flow gap. He said it while we were both making dinner, him chopping vegetables, me reading something on my phone, and I said okay without really processing it. Okay, sure. What do you need? I transferred $3,000 that evening. I didn't think about it again for weeks. Then months. The money was gone, absorbed into whatever need had required it, and no one mentioned repayment. And I didn't push because I actually thought it was a one-time thing. That I'd helped. That it was over. It was not one time. It was not over. The transfers grew. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed me if I'd been watching. But I wasn't watching. I was working. I was traveling for work, presenting to clients, building a career that required most of my mental bandwidth, and my husband handled the household finances the way he handled most things at that point, with apparent confidence and very little transparency. I trusted him because trusting your spouse with money feels like the basic minimum of a functioning marriage. Because questioning every transaction feels like accusation. Because I didn't want to be the woman who monitored her husband. Richard came to dinner at our apartment for the first time about 2 years in. I cooked, which I rarely do, because I wanted to make a good impression, or a better one. We'd always met at their house before, on his territory, where his wife set the table and controlled the rhythm of the evening. I wanted him to see ours. Our home, our life, the thing my husband and I had built. He sat at our table and looked around the apartment with an expression I recognized only later as appraisal. He asked about the square footage. He asked about the building. He said, with that particular brand of indirectness that powerful men use when they want to say something without saying it, that it was smart we'd chosen this neighborhood. Good investment, he said. Appreciate the location. Then he turned to me and said, still pleasantly, you know, Claire, with what you earn, you too could really be building something significant. He said it like a compliment. Like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging my income. Like my salary was a dormant asset waiting for someone smarter to activate it. I smiled. I said something noncommittal. My husband poured more wine. That's the moment I should have understood the architecture of what was being built. I didn't. I smiled and poured more wine and let Richard talk about construction margins and land values and the particular vision he had for a project he was developing on the north side of the city. A mixed-use development. Retail on the ground floor, residential above. He talked about it the way people talk about a future that is already decided. Not a possibility. A certainty. I asked who was financing it. He looked at me the way people look at someone who has asked a question outside the bounds of the conversation they were trying to have. Then he smiled. We're working through the details, he said. Family has always found a way. I did not understand. That evening. That I was the way. It took a voicemail to break it open. I was at the office on a Thursday afternoon, reviewing Q3 projections, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. I always let unknown numbers go to voicemail. When I listened later, it was a loan officer from a bank I'd never dealt with. She said she was following up on a co-signed application. She said there were some documents that needed my signature before they could proceed. She said my name and my social security number and the words co-signed application in the same sentence with a cheerfulness that suggested she had no idea. I had no idea what she was talking about. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I called her back. The application was for a business loan. $450,000. The co-signer listed was me. The information on the application, my employment history, my income, my credit score was accurate. Someone had submitted a very accurate picture of my financial life to a bank in support of a loan for a business I had never agreed to support. The business was my father-in-law's development company. I asked the loan officer to suspend the application. I told her there had been an error. I used a calm voice because I have learned, over years of working in finance, that calm voices get more information than panicked ones. She confirmed the suspension. She also confirmed, when I pressed gently, that this was the second application attempted. The first had been declined 3 months earlier. 3 months earlier. I'd had no idea. I drove home that evening instead of taking the train, the way I usually did. I needed the time. I sat in traffic on the bridge, and I watched the lights on the water, and I thought about the transfers. The 3,000 that started it. The amounts I hadn't tracked carefully enough. The casualness. The vagueness. The way my husband had said, 100 times in 100 different contexts, Dad has a plan. I didn't confront anyone that night. I made dinner. I asked my husband how his day was. He told me. I listened. I watched him the way you watch someone when you're seeing them differently for the first time and trying to understand how you missed what you're now seeing. His ease. His comfort. The way he moved through our home like everything in it was settled and solid, like nothing was complicated. I thought, he genuinely might not know what his father did. Or he knew and told himself it was temporary. Or he knew and decided I would handle it the way I had always handled everything. Any of those possibilities was its own kind of answer. That weekend, Richard hosted a dinner for his wife's birthday. Extended family, neighbors, their contractor friends, people from the business world my father-in-law moved through. We were expected to attend. My husband asked that morning if I could bring the dessert. I said yes. I brought a very nice cheesecake from the bakery on Delaney Street, and I smiled when I arrived and kissed my mother-in-law on the cheek, and I sat at the table and watched. Richard held court the way he always did. He told a story about a city councilman who'd finally approved a zoning variance, and everyone laughed in the way that people laugh at the powerful person's story. With enthusiasm that has very little to do with humor, he talked about the development. The North Side Project. He used words like legacy and vision and family investment. Then he raised his glass. He said he wanted to thank the people around the table who had believed in the project, who had contributed to making the vision real. He looked at my husband. He looked at me. He said that when a family understands that success is shared, that resources belong to the whole, that's when real things get built. The table applauded softly. My mother-in-law beamed. My husband raised his glass and met mine with a small clink and said quietly, "Nice, isn't it? Being part of something." I looked at him for a moment. I raised my own glass and I said, "To clarity. Because I've found that when things are genuinely clear, everyone benefits." There was a half-second pause. Richard looked at me. His smile stayed, but the quality of it shifted slightly, the way a photograph shifts when you tilt it in the light. Then the table moved on, and someone asked about the timeline, and Richard was talking again, and my husband put his hand on mine under the table, the way he did when he wanted to signal that everything was fine. I let him keep his hand there, and I began, in the quietest room of my mind, to work. I didn't sleep much that weekend. I pulled every financial document I could access. Bank statements I should have been reviewing monthly and hadn't because I'd ceded that territory to my husband 2 years into our marriage as a kind of good faith gesture. Our shared account. The account I'd funded consistently with more than my husband had contributed. The transfers. The amounts. Dates, descriptions, recipient accounts. I built a spreadsheet the way I build every spreadsheet. Methodically, without emotion. Letting the numbers speak in the particular language. Numbers speak when no one's been paying attention to them. The transfers totaled just over $22,000 across 3 years. Not catastrophic. Not nothing. Amounts that had been sized, I noticed, to stay just below the threshold that would have triggered questions from me. Whoever had set those amounts, whether it was my husband or his father, directing my husband understood enough about how I thought to calibrate the extraction carefully. That precision bothered me more than the money. On Monday, I called a lawyer. Not a family friend, not someone anyone in my husband's life would know. A woman I'd found through a colleague's recommendation, someone who specialized in financial matters in marriage and the particular overlapping territories of family business and marital assets. I explained the loan application. I explained the transfers. I explained the toast and what Richard had said about shared resources. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 2 or 3 specific questions. Then she said, "You have documentation of all of this?" I said I was building it. She said, "Keep building." I scheduled an appointment with my bank for Tuesday and spoke to someone in their fraud department. I flagged the loan application. I requested that my accounts be placed under additional security protocols. I changed passwords, changed authorizations, removed my husband's secondary access to the account we shared, which I was legally entitled to do as a joint holder requesting a separation of accounts. The banker was professional and efficient. I was professional and efficient. It took 45 minutes, and when I walked out into the Tuesday afternoon light, I felt something I recognized as air. Like I'd been in a room with a slow leak and someone had finally opened a window. My husband called on Thursday evening. He was still at the office, which was my father-in-law's office, which meant he was probably sitting across from his father when he made the call or had just left. His voice had that particular flatness that it gets when he's been told something and is trying to figure out how to deliver it. He said the bank had rejected the loan. He said there had been some kind of freeze on the application. He said his father was trying to figure out what happened. I said, I said, "That's strange." He said, "Yeah, they're looking into it." I said, "Okay, let me know if I can help." He said, "Sure." We hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, and then I put it on the counter and finished making my tea. Richard called me directly the next day. He never called me directly. It went to voicemail, and when I listened, his voice had shed the dinner party warmth, and what remained underneath was harder and more direct. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the loan was a straightforward arrangement. He said he hoped we could discuss it as a family. He said family meant people who looked out for each other. I texted him back. I said I looked forward to discussing it. I said my lawyer would be in touch. 3 minutes of silence. Then, your lawyer? I didn't respond. My husband came home that evening looking like someone who had been on the receiving end of a long phone call. He sat down on the couch and rubbed his hands over his face and said, "Claire, what did you do?" I poured myself a glass of water, and I sat across from him, and I said, "What did I do?" He said his father was upset. He said this was a family matter. He said the loan was temporary, that the business was almost at a point where it could sustain itself, that I would have gotten the money back with interest. I asked him how long he had known his father was planning to co-sign my name on a loan without my knowledge. He went very quiet. I asked again, not loudly, just with the particular precision of someone who has decided to stop accepting vague answers. He said he thought his father had handled it. He said he thought I knew. He said the words in a sequence that made them technically sentences without making them honest. I said, "I warned you before we got married that I needed a partner who was honest with me about money." I said, that was not a small thing I said. I said it clearly. You remember. He said he knew. He said he was sorry. He said his father had pressured him, and he hadn't known how to say no, and it got to a point where it felt like too late to say anything. I looked at him for a long time. He looked like the man I married and also like someone I was meeting for the first time, and the combination of those two things was the saddest part of all of it. I said, "I'm not angry," and I meant it. The anger had come and gone in the first 48 hours. What I had now was clarity, which is quieter and more durable than anger. I said, "I'm going to handle this correctly. I need you to understand that handling it correctly might be uncomfortable for your father." He said, "Claire." I said, "I know. I know it's complicated. But someone put my name and my credit on a document I didn't sign. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud." He flinched at the word. I understood why. The word fraud, applied to your father, is a different weight than it is in the abstract. I said, "I am not trying to destroy your father. I am trying to get my name off a document I didn't authorize, recover money that was taken without transparency, and make sure this doesn't happen again. That's all. How your father responds to that is his choice." The letter from my lawyer arrived at Richard's address on a Wednesday. I know because my lawyer told me when she sent it, and I tracked the general timeline in my head the way I track everything now. It was formal and specific, and it outlined the unauthorized loan application, the transfers from our shared account, and the necessary steps for resolution. It was not aggressive. It was accurate. Richard did not call me after that. He called my husband. He called him at length, multiple times, in the kind of calls that I could infer from the way my husband moved through the apartment afterwards tightly, carefully, like someone navigating a room that has been rearranged in the dark. His father told him I was being vindictive. He told him I was destroying the business. He told him good wives supported their husbands' families. He told him money was meant to move within family, that keeping ledgers was cold, that I had embarrassed everyone by bringing lawyers into something that could have been talked through. My husband relayed some of these things to me. Not all of them, I think. He softened the ones he told me, and even softened they had a weight to them that I suspect his father had applied with full force. I listened. I said I understood. I said I was still proceeding. He asked if we could find another way. I asked what way he had in mind. He didn't have an answer to that. What happened next was quiet. That's the thing about having documentation. You don't need to be loud. My lawyer communicated with Richard's lawyer. My lawyer also communicated with the bank's fraud division, which opened its own review process. In the course of that process, certain things came to light about the development company's financial practices that my father-in-law had not anticipated being examined. Tax filings. The way certain personal expenses had been categorized as business costs. The way certain family transfers had been recorded or not recorded depending on what was convenient. None of this was the earthquake Richard had managed to avoid for several years by moving money carefully and keeping conversations vague. My name on a loan application he hadn't asked me about was the thing that opened the door. His lawyer reached out to mine on a Friday afternoon. They wanted to settle. They wanted to settle quickly, quietly, completely. The terms required my name removed from all company filings or documents where it had appeared without my written consent, and there were more of these than I had initially known about. Reimbursement of the full $22,000 from our shared account, plus interest, calculated at the standard rate. A formal written acknowledgement that no further financial arrangements would be made involving my assets without my direct written consent. And my agreement not to pursue the loan application matter further with the bank's fraud division. I reviewed the terms with my lawyer. I slept on it for 2 nights. Then I agreed. Not because I couldn't have pushed further. I probably could have. But I had gotten what I needed. My name, my credit, my money, my documentation. Pressing beyond that would have required more months and more energy and more of my attention, and I had decided that Richard was not worth the remainder of my year. Richard paid the full amount within 10 days. I know because it arrived in my account in a single transfer, no note, no message attached. Just the number. 22,000 and change. I confirmed it with my bank. I updated my spreadsheet. I closed that column. My husband and I had one more conversation. A real one. Not the negotiations wrapped in marriage ones we'd been having for weeks, but a conversation where we both sat at the kitchen table with nothing between us and said the actual things. He said he knew he had let it go too far. He said he had told himself it was family and that family was complicated and that I was capable enough to handle anything that came up. He said that last part slowly, like he was hearing it out loud for the first time and recognizing what it sounded like. I said, I know you love your father. I said, I know the business means something to you that's bigger than money. I said, I'm not asking you to stop loving your father. But I am telling you that I cannot be in a marriage where my financial security is treated as a resource that other people can access without my knowledge. He asked if we could get past it. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it. Not performing the pause, actually considering it. Looking at the man across from me and trying to see who he was without the history, without the last 4 years, without the transfers and the vagueness and the particular silence he'd chosen over and over when choosing differently would have cost him something. I said I didn't know. I said I needed time outside of this apartment, outside of his family's orbit, to understand what I actually thought and felt about the two of us separate from everything that had happened. I said that wasn't a dramatic announcement. It wasn't a final answer. It was just the honest thing. He nodded very slowly. I moved into a short-term furnished apartment on the other side of the city 3 weeks later. I packed what was mine, which was most things, because most things had been purchased with my income. I didn't make that observation out loud. I just moved what I needed and left what I didn't and wrote my husband a note that said I would be in touch and that I hoped he would take this time to think clearly too. The furnished apartment had big windows. In the mornings, I made coffee and sat by those windows and watched the city do its ordinary business people. Walking dogs, a bakery truck double parked, pigeons reorganizing themselves on the fire escape across the street. There was something very restoring about it. The ordinariness. The sense that the world was going about its processes independent of all the things that had just occupied every corner of my attention. My father-in-law sent one message, through my husband, asking if we could have a conversation. I thought about it. I said no. I said I wished him well with the business and with whatever restructuring the tax situation required, but that I had nothing more to discuss with him and no interest in a conversation whose purpose would be to smooth things over for his benefit rather than address anything real. My husband relayed this. I don't know what Richard's response was. My husband didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. A friend called me about a month into the apartment period. She asked how I was. I said I was okay, which was true, and also a complicated container for a lot of other things that were also true. She asked if I was lonely. I said sometimes. I said mostly I felt like I could breathe, and that I hadn't realized until the pressure was gone how much pressure there had been. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I was letting it be unknown for a while, which was something I'd never been good at, sitting with questions that didn't have answers yet. I said I was practicing it. She laughed and said that sounded very mature. I said it felt mostly like insomnia, but with better lighting. There are things I know now that I didn't know 4 years ago. I know that generosity without boundaries is not generosity, it's an invitation. I know that when someone shows you their sense of entitlement, you should believe what you're seeing rather than explaining it away as cultural or temporary or complicated. I know that silence in a marriage isn't neutral. Silence is a form of consent, and if you remain silent long enough, The people around you will assume your silence means yes. I know that removing yourself from a situation that doesn't serve you is not the same as failing. I spent a long time believing that staying, working through it, absorbing the discomfort was strength. That leaving, even temporarily, even partially, was a kind of weakness or giving up. I understand now. That's a story that benefits the people who need you to stay. It doesn't benefit you. I know that money is not just money. Money is the material form of what people believe they're entitled to. When someone reaches into your financial life without asking, they're not just taking resources. They're telling you exactly what they think of you. They're telling you that your consent is optional, that your awareness is inconvenient, that your labor is available to be redirected by people who know better than you how it should be used. I am 32 years old. I am a senior financial analyst. I have spent the last 4 years funding a life that people treated as a communal resource, and I did that partly because I was trusting and partly because I was busy and partly because no one ever tells you, in direct language, that you are being managed. They use words like family and support and we and together. They make it feel like participation. They make it feel like love. The difference between love and leverage is whether your answer would be respected if it were no. That's the question I should have asked earlier. I know the answer now because I gave the no and watched what happened. The warmth dropped. The family language disappeared. What remained was a calculation that had been running the whole time underneath the warmth, and once I was no longer useful to the calculation, I wasn't particularly interesting to the people running it. That's not a tragedy. That's information. Very clean, very useful information. My lawyer closed the file. My accounts are my own. My credit is undamaged. My name is off every document it was placed on without my knowledge. I kept the spreadsheet not because I look at it regularly, but because it exists. Because the numbers are there, and they are real, and they happened, and I am the one who found them and the one who addressed them. Nobody gave me that. I built it the way I build everything, methodically, without emotion, with attention to the details that other people hoped I wouldn't notice. I'm still in the apartment with the big windows. I'm still deciding. But I am deciding. That part is mine. It always was.